In the sleepy town of Blackwood, stories about the woods beyond the town's edge were whispered in hushed voices. Rumors swirled about a creature with elongated limbs, faceless and shrouded in shadows. The townsfolk spoke of people disappearing without a trace, and those who returned often did so with haunted eyes and fractured minds. No one dared to speak his name aloud, but everyone knew who haunted those trees: Slenderman. The legend said he preyed on the lonely and the lost, calling out in a voiceless whisper that only the unlucky could hear. Despite the warnings, 4 friends Ben, Clara, Lucy, and Kyle decided to venture into the Blackwood forest on a cold October night, just before Halloween. They were young, reckless, and eager to prove their bravery. But as the shadows closed in, they would soon learn that some legends are rooted in far more than superstition. "Come on, guys. It's just a bunch of stories meant to scare little kids," Ben scoffed, flicking his flashlight on and off as the 4 friends gathered at the edge of the forest. The trees loomed tall and silent, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Clara crossed her arms, her brow furrowing. "You don't seriously believe that, do you? My uncle swears he saw something in these woods last year. He still won't talk about it." "Exactly," Lucy shuddered, hugging herself tightly. "What if something is really out there? We don't know what's hiding in these trees." Kyle chuckled and nudged Ben with his elbow. "Come on, it'll be fine. We'll stick together, take a few pictures, and prove that there's nothing but squirrels and raccoons out there." Ben held up his phone, snapping a selfie of the group. "A few snapshots for our Halloween thrill seekers. Let's go." With a final glance at each other, the group stepped into the forest, the crunch of leaves underfoot breaking the silence. A full moon hung overhead, casting just enough light to pierce through the dense canopy and illuminate a narrow trail. As they ventured deeper, an uneasy quiet settled over them, and their laughter and banter faded. The trees seemed to close in, forming a maze of twisted branches and shadows that swallowed them whole. An hour passed, and the deeper they ventured, the more disoriented they became. The moon was now hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, and the flashlight beams barely cut through the darkness. Every branch that snapped made them jump, and the shadows felt alive, shifting in the corners of their eyes. "I thought you knew the way," Clara said, her voice tight with anxiety. Ben stammered, casting his flashlight around the unfamiliar trees. I thought I did. We should have come across the river by now." The group fell silent, glancing around as an oppressive stillness settled over the forest. Lucy held onto Kyle's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Guys, do you feel like we're being watched?" Before anyone could respond, a low hum began to resonate through the trees. It was faint but unmistakable, a strange, pulsating sound that seemed to vibrate through their bones. The hairs on the back of Ben's neck stood on end as he looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. What is that?" he stammered, but no one had an answer. The hum grew louder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and coil, taking on an almost unnatural shape. Suddenly, Clara gasped, pointing at a figure standing motionless in the distance, just barely visible between the trees. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. At first, it was hard to make out, but as they squinted into the darkness, they saw him. Tall, impossibly thin, with arms too long and fingers that stretched like tendrils. His face was a smooth, pale void, devoid of any features. Slenderman. A sense of dread washed over the group, and they took an instinctive step back. But as they moved, Slenderman seemed to drift closer, his form gliding eerily without movement. Ben grabbed Clara's hand, and the group turned, running blindly through the trees. Branches scratched their faces and tore at their clothes, but they didn't stop. The forest seemed to close in on them, twisting and shifting until the path they'd come from had vanished. Lucy cried out, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. They stumbled upon a small clearing, gasping for breath as they looked around. Slenderman was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. What does he want?" Kyle panted, his eyes wide with fear. Ben swallowed hard. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving. We can't let him catch us." A sudden rustling in the trees made them freeze. The shadows moved again, and in a blur, Slenderman appeared at the edge of the clearing, his long fingers reaching out as if to beckon them closer. They ran deeper into the forest, their breaths ragged and panicked. Hours passed in a blur as they tried to find their way out, but no matter which direction they chose, they ended up back at the same twisted trees, the same oppressive darkness. It was as if the forest itself was alive, trapping them in an endless loop. Clara was the first to break. She sank to the ground, her hands over her ears as she rocked back and forth, whispering incoherently, "He's in my head. I can feel him. Watching. Waiting." Ben tried to pull her to her feet, but she jerked away, her eyes wide and wild. "Don't touch me. He'll find us." Lucy began to sob, and Kyle wrapped his arms around her, but his own face was etched with terror. Slenderman's presence grew stronger, his figure appearing and disappearing among the trees like a mirage. Ben's mind raced. He knew they couldn't run forever. In a moment of clarity, he remembered the stories he'd heard about Slenderman, how he was drawn to fear and desperation, how he played with his prey before the end. Maybe if they stopped running, if they confronted him. "Guys, we have to stand our ground," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "If we keep running, we're just playing his game. Maybe if we face him, he'll leave us alone." Lucy shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Are you insane? He's a monster. He'll kill us." But Kyle nodded, his jaw clenched. "Ben's right. We're trapped here because we're scared. He feeds on it. Maybe if we show him we're not afraid." They formed a circle, standing shoulder to shoulder as they faced the shadows. Slenderman appeared again, gliding toward them with a slow, deliberate grace. His faceless head tilted as if in amusement, his long fingers stretching toward them. They held their ground, refusing to back down. But as he drew closer, the fear became overwhelming, a suffocating wave that crushed their resolve. One by one, they faltered, their courage slipping away as his silent, endless gaze bore into them. Days passed before a search party found the remains of their campsite, abandoned and untouched. There was no sign of Ben, Clara, Lucy, or Kyle, only their scattered belongings and a strange, unnatural silence that hung heavy in the air. The townsfolk spoke in whispers, adding the four friends to the long list of those who had vanished in Blackwood Forest. But as the legend of Slenderman continued to grow, one thing was clear: the forest had claimed more lives, and it would not be the last time. For those who dared to wander into the woods at night, the shadows would always be waiting,